The first time anyone truly noticed her, it wasn't because of what she did, but because of what she accidentally revealed. She moved through the building like she had done countless times before, steady, quiet, and almost invisible to the people around her. The polished floors reflected the soft rhythm of her work, and the faint sound of her cart followed her like a shadow. To everyone else, she was just another cleaning staff member fulfilling her duties without interruption. No one asked her name, no one paused to acknowledge her presence, and she had grown used to that silence. Was safer that way. Inside, however, she carried a discipline that didn't match her surroundings. Every movement was precise, every step measured, as if she had once been trained to operate in a completely different environment. Her expression remained calm, but her eyes occasionally scanned her surroundings with quiet awareness. She was careful, not out of fear alone, but out of habit formed over years of learning when to stay unseen. When her phone vibrated softly, she hesitated for a brief moment, glancing around to ensure she was alone. It was an instinct she had developed, a subtle check that had become second nature. Once satisfied, she answered the call and lowered her voice slightly. At first, her tone was unremarkable, simple, and reserved. But within seconds, something shifted. Her language changed, the words flowed with clarity and confidence, forming sentences in Dutch that came naturally, without hesitation or effort. Her voice carried a different energy now, one that was structured, educated, and composed. It was no longer the voice of someone trying to stay unnoticed, but of someone accustomed to expressing thoughts with precision and fluency. The contrast was subtle, but unmistakable. Unaware that anyone was paying close attention, she continued the conversation, her focus entirely on the call. Behind her, footsteps paused. A man who had been walking past slowed down, then stopped completely. He didn't turn at first. Instead, he listened, his expression changing as he recognized the language. It was unexpected in this setting, unfamiliar in a place where such conversations rarely occurred. His curiosity was immediate, but he remained composed. From his position, he observed her quietly, noting the way she carried herself even while speaking. There was no sign of confusion, no struggle for words, only fluency and control. For a brief moment, the contrast between her appearance and her speech created a question in his mind that he could not ignore. When the call ended, she returned to silence as quickly as she had entered it. Her posture shifted slightly, and her expression settled back into its usual calm neutrality. She resumed her work without hesitation, as though nothing had happened at all. Something had already changed, at least for the men who had overheard her. He continued walking, but his thoughts remained behind. What he had heard did not fit the image in front of him, and that contradiction stayed with him longer than expected. For the first time that day, the routine around him felt slightly different, as if a hidden detail had surfaced beneath the surface of an otherwise ordinary moment. He could not ignore what he had heard, no matter how much he tried to return to his routine. Meetings went on, conversations continued, but his attention kept drifting back to that brief moment in the hallway. It was not just the language that stayed with him, it was the ease with which she spoke it, the confidence in her tone, the clarity in every phrase. It didn't sound like memorized words or casual learning. It sounded like someone who had lived it. Later that day, he found himself walking past the same corridor again, slowing down without realizing it. She was there, just as before, moving steadily from one section to another, focused on her work. She didn't look up immediately, but when she did, it was only for a second. Eyes met briefly, and then she returned to her task as though nothing had happened. That brief exchange, however, was enough for him to sense something unspoken. He began to observe more carefully, not in an intrusive way, but with quiet attention. The way she handled her responsibilities showed a level of discipline that stood out. There was no hesitation in her movements, no distraction in her focus. Everything she did seemed intentional. It made him question how someone with such composure ended up in a role where she was largely overlooked. As the hours passed, his curiosity grew stronger. He tried to rationalize it, telling himself it was just an unusual coincidence, something harmless and easily explained. Deep down, he knew it wasn't something he could dismiss so quickly. There was a story here, one that had not been told, and for reasons he couldn't fully explain, he felt drawn to understand it. The following morning, he arrived earlier than usual, not because of any scheduled obligation, but because he wanted to see her again under the same quiet conditions. The building was still settling into its day, with fewer people moving through the corridors, creating a calmer environment. He positioned himself in a place where he could observe without drawing attention, maintaining the same composed demeanor he always carried in professional settings. She appeared on time, just as she always did. Her routine began without delay, her movements consistent and familiar. There was a sense of structure in the way she approached her work, as if each step followed an internal order she had long since mastered. While others might have rushed through similar tasks, she maintained a steady rhythm that reflected patience and control. He watched closely this time, not just for what he had heard before, but for anything else that might confirm his growing suspicion. There were small details that began to stand out. The way she adjusted her grip on the cleaning tools, the way she paused briefly to assess her surroundings before moving on, the quiet awareness in her posture. These were not random habits. He suggested training, or at the very least, experience that extended beyond basic expectations. At one point, she stepped aside to allow a group of employees to pass. She lowered her gaze respectfully, yet there was no sign of discomfort or insecurity in her body language. Instead, she carried herself with a calm presence that did not seek attention, but also did not appear diminished by it. It was a balance that intrigued him further. As she continued her work, he found himself questioning the gap between what he saw and what he had heard. The contrast felt too distinct to ignore. It was not simply about language anymore. It was about identity, and how easily it could be hidden in plain sight. He realized that assumptions often fill the gaps when information is limited, but in this case, those assumptions no longer felt reliable. By the time she finished her assigned area and moved on, he had already made a quiet decision. This was no longer just a passing curiosity. He intended to understand more, even if it meant stepping slightly outside his usual boundaries of observation and into a more direct approach, though he had not yet decided how or when to do so. That afternoon, the atmosphere in the building felt slightly busier than before, with more people moving through the corridors and conversations echoing softly across the polished surfaces. Amid the activity, she continued her routine without disruption, maintaining the same steady pace she had shown earlier. Her focus remained consistent, unaffected by the presence of others, as though she had learned to function efficiently regardless of her surroundings. He, on the other hand, found himself waiting for the right moment. He did not want to approach her abruptly or create an impression that might make her uncomfortable. Instead, he observed from a distance, considering how best to initiate a conversation that would feel natural rather than intrusive. He was aware that his position and presence might already carry an unspoken influence, so he chose patience over immediacy. At one point, she paused near a quiet corner to organize her cleaning supplies. It was a brief moment of stillness in an otherwise continuous routine. He noticed how she handled each item with care, placing them in order without unnecessary movement. There was a sense of efficiency in her actions, but also a quiet attention to detail that suggested discipline beyond the surface level of her role. He slowly made his way toward her location, keeping his expression neutral and his approach unhurried. When he reached a comfortable distance, he stopped, allowing the moment to unfold naturally rather than forcing it. She sensed his presence before he spoke, her posture subtly shifting as she acknowledged someone nearby. For a brief second, neither of them said anything. It was a pause filled with quiet awareness, as if both were measuring the situation in their own way. Then he spoke calmly, choosing his words with care, initiating a simple greeting rather than a direct question. Responded politely, maintaining the same composed tone she had used with others throughout the day. The interaction remained brief, but it was significant in its own way. It marked the first time their exchange moved beyond observation into direct communication. Though nothing about the conversation revealed anything unusual on the surface, the underlying tension of unspoken questions lingered between them, setting the stage for a more meaningful interaction in the moments that would follow. The brief conversation lingered in his thoughts longer than he expected. It had been simple, polite, and entirely ordinary on the surface, yet it carried an unspoken weight that made it feel different. He replayed her tone, her expressions, and the way she maintained composure throughout the exchange. Nothing in her behavior contradicted her role, yet nothing fully aligned with the impression he had formed after hearing her speak Dutch. Over the next few hours, he returned to his usual responsibilities, attending to matters that required his attention. Still, in the quieter moments between tasks, his mind drifted back to her. He began to consider the possibility that there was a reason she chose to present herself in such a reserved manner. People often adapted to circumstances in ways that were not immediately visible to others, and he wondered what kind of experiences might have shaped her into someone so careful with her presence. Meanwhile, she continued her work without interruption. Her routine remained unchanged, but there was a subtle difference now. She was aware that someone had noticed something about her, even if it had not been addressed directly. That awareness added a layer of caution to her movements, not out of fear, but out of habit. She had learned over time that attention could lead to questions, and questions could lead to situations she preferred to avoid. As the day progressed, their paths crossed once more, this time in a shared hallway where foot traffic was minimal. She slowed slightly as she approached, and he did the same. This time, the silence between them felt less accidental and more intentional. It was not uncomfortable, but it carried a quiet expectation, as though both were aware that something unspoken was gradually forming. He considered asking a direct question, but chose restraint instead. Rushing the moment could create distance rather than understanding. She acknowledged him with a polite nod before continuing on her way, maintaining her usual pace. Yet as she passed, there was a brief moment where her expression shifted almost imperceptibly, suggesting that she recognized the significance of their repeated encounters. He watched her leave the corridor, realizing that the situation had evolved beyond a single moment of curiosity. It was now a pattern, subtle but undeniable, and with each passing interaction, the distance between observation and understanding seemed to narrow, even if only slightly. That evening, the building grew quieter as most of the employees finished their shifts and the corridors slowly emptied. The change in atmosphere made every sound more noticeable, every movement more defined. She remained longer than most, continuing her duties with the same consistency she had shown throughout the day. There was no sign of haste in her actions, only a steady commitment to completing what was expected of her. He stayed behind as well, though not for work that required urgency. Instead, he used the extended time as an opportunity to observe in a more relaxed setting. Without the usual crowd, it became easier to notice subtle details that might otherwise go unseen. He moved through the space casually, appearing as though he was concluding his own schedule, while in reality, he was waiting for another opportunity to cross paths with her. When their paths eventually aligned again, it happened near the exit area. Preparing to leave, organizing her belongings with quiet efficiency, he approached at a measured pace, ensuring his presence did not feel abrupt. This time, the moment felt different from the previous encounters. The environment was calmer, and there were fewer distractions around them. He greeted her again, this time with a slightly more open tone. She responded as before, maintaining politeness, but there was a brief hesitation in her expression that suggested she was more aware of the situation than she had been earlier in the day. It was subtle, yet noticeable to someone who had been paying close attention. He chose not to address the topic directly. Instead, he engaged in a light and general conversation, allowing the interaction to remain natural. He participated briefly, answering in short, careful responses. While the exchange did not reveal anything new on the surface, it reinforced his impression that she was deliberate in how much she chose to share. As the conversation came to a close, she prepared to leave, and he stepped aside to allow her to pass. Before walking away, she offered a small nod of acknowledgement, one that carried a quiet sense of respect. He returned the gesture, watching as she exited the building and disappeared into the evening outside. Left alone in the now quiet space, he stood still for a moment, reflecting on the day's interactions. What had started as a chance observation had gradually developed into something more structured in his mind. Each encounter added another layer, not in the form of answers, but in the form of deeper questions. And with those questions came a growing sense that understanding her story would require more than simple observation. The following day began with a different sense of anticipation. What had once been a random observation had now become a quiet intention. He arrived with a clearer purpose, not to observe from a distance, but to understand in a more direct and respectful way. The brief interactions from the previous days had confirmed one thing for him: there was more to her than what appeared on the surface, and that realization had only strengthened his curiosity. She arrived as usual, maintaining her consistent routine. Her movements were familiar, her focus unchanged, yet there was a slight awareness in the way she carried herself now, as if she understood that their paths would likely cross again. She continued her work without interruption, but her composure carried a subtle alertness, not tense, but attentive. Later in the morning, their paths met once more in a quieter section of the building. This time, he did not hesitate. Approached with calm confidence, stopping at a respectful distance before speaking. His tone was steady, and his words were chosen carefully, not to pressure her, but to acknowledge what he had already heard days earlier. For a brief moment, she did not respond. Her expression changed slightly, revealing a mix of surprise and recognition. The silence between them carried a different weight now, no longer just casual or coincidental, but meaningful. She realized that the moment she had been quietly avoiding had finally arrived. When she spoke, her response was measured. She did not immediately confirm or deny anything. Instead, she chose her words carefully, as though deciding how much of herself she was willing to reveal. He listened without interrupting, allowing her the space to speak at her own pace. The dynamic between them shifted in that moment, moving from observation to understanding, even if only partially. What followed was not a full explanation, but the beginning of one. She shared just enough to acknowledge that there was truth behind what he had heard, without going into complete detail. It was clear that her past held layers she was not ready to revisit fully, yet the fact that she chose to respond at all marked a turning point. He respected her boundaries, not pressing further than she was comfortable with. Instead, he accepted the moment for what it was, an opening rather than a conclusion. For the first time, the distance between their worlds felt slightly reduced, not by circumstance, but by mutual recognition. She returned to her work and he stepped away. Both carried a new awareness. What had begun as a simple overheard conversation had evolved into something more personal and more complex. And while many questions still remained unanswered, the foundation for understanding had finally been established, quietly, and without force.